I'm Josh Hammer, opinion editor of Newsweek and research fellow at the Edmund Burke Foundation, and this is NatCon Squad. On today's show, we're discussing big tech, China, and what appears to be a Senate power sharing agreement in a divided Senate. So for our first topic, big tech, it's the issue of the day. We're all talking about it. We all have lots of thoughts on it, but I'm going to kick it over to my co-host, Ben Weingarten, to get us started. Ben?
Thanks, Josh. This is the topic of the day because really what it concerns is the ability to have what at least remains of a free and open marketplace of ideas. And in reality, it goes beyond big tech to our entire civil society. Are we going to exist under a progressive or bigot paradigm, or will it be a truly big tent where dissenting views are not only welcomed, but are debated openly? And there was a great Wall Street Journal article that talks about makes the case that big tech is essentially serving as an adjunct of the state to suppress the First Amendment through the use, of course, of politicians essentially with a wink and a nudge telling big tech companies to snuff out certain dissenting voices from platforms. And then, of course, the implicit threats of regulation and going after these organizations through their oversight powers and the like in kabuki theater hearings. Really, this is all about the free and open marketplace of ideas and where they are disseminated when it comes to social media or big tech companies. So I'll kick it off first to Rachel, who has written some exceptional stuff about this defining issue of our time on the First Amendment.
Well, thanks. I think for the right on this issue, it really is a question of corporate power merging with state power and what it is that we do about it. And unfortunately, I think the right doesn't have a very good framework for how to think about this and for how to approach it from a policy standpoint. And you see this. Recently from a libertarian response to Josh, actually, when he was, I think, talking about this issue, and the libertarian was like, there is nothing conservative about using power of the government to address, what is this fusion of the corp state. And actually, there's a lot conservative about that, right? That's actually trying to conserve, what is a free and open society in what constitutes now the public square and the avenues and the channels of free communication. And so I think you have a section of the right that is still very reflexive about saying, well, private business, corporations, there can be no other threat to liberty than the government itself. And I think what we've seen over the last month or two has just proven that false, particularly when you have this fusion of, it's not just corporate power and state power, it's economic power and, specific corporate power and government power, all working to enforce certain viewpoints, enforce certain behaviors, and to punish those who don't agree. Josh Hawley is just sort of the most recent proxy example of this, right? He's being shut off from publishers. Hotels won't let him hold fundraisers. He cannot speak on significant issues, in different venues. People are just canceling him all over, but he's not the first, right? This used to be just Alex Jones. This used to be just Laura Loomer. And, we've reached the slippery slope that it's like snowballed down into the gulch at this point is kind of where we are. And, the right has no response to it. And this is the challenge for its survival, I think, is how to respond to this kind of question.
Yeah, and I want to jump in here because I think Rachel defined the problem really well. And it's not just tech and it's not just state, it's also the media, right? So if all of these things are together corrupt at this level of bias and this level of, making the decision that anybody who dissents from full progressive dogma is necessarily worthy of censorship and deserving of censorship, we're in a really, really dangerous position. And Rachel used a word that I want to sort of zoom in on right now, and it's fusion. And the way that fusionism was once understood isn't working right now. It's not an answer to the problems that we're facing in 2021, because the market, as we've seen with big tech, is not equipped and is not able to respond to the problems of big tech. And that's what is conservative about jumping in here with state power. Now, I may disagree with some of you guys on what extent of state power should be used here, but the market right now is the conservatism here, and let's use the definition of conservatism literally. It's not just about conserving the economy and conserving the free market system. And the free market system is the best system in the world, and has not eradicated poverty, but lifted so many people out of poverty over the course of human history. But the market needs to also conserve our culture, our way of life, and a culture that will actually also facilitate fair markets. And that's not what we have right now at all. And to sort of get to the cultural root of what Rachel was talking about, that's why I think we're in a really dangerous position, and there's plenty of space for conservatives to jump into the fray legislatively and culturally.
Emily, one follow-up on that. The Federalist, a publication near and dear to both of our hearts, with you being the culture editor there and me being a senior contributor there, itself faced what could have been at least an implicit near-death experience with big tech clamping down. I wonder what were your takeaways from that whole exercise of the force of a quasi-state entity in Google trying to crush, or at least threaten to crush, the Federalist?
Well, I think we got an early taste, and to call it an early taste is an indication of how quickly this has progressed, because that happened in June, I think. Google threatened to deplatform us from their advertising over our comments section, which is ridiculous because Google owns YouTube, and YouTube has the nicest, kindest comment section on the internet. But I think we got an early taste of what people started to discover when that sort of chain reaction after January 6th went off, which is that the sort of like, and Rachel can definitely speak to this, Josh can definitely speak to this, the scope of the monopolies that some of these companies hold. Like, I don't think people actually really realized how dominant Amazon Web Services was. I don't think people realized how dominant Google Ads were, all of that stuff. And that was sort of like an early taste for us. But now we're learning just that, like, it's not just being able to send a tweet that you want, it's also your web server, it's also your advertiser. And you could just sort of go down the line of elements of the internet that are owned by a few companies.
But that's really the critical part of the question, though, right? What we're seeing now is the guts of capitalism being ripped away from people for wrongthink. And when you are not allowed to run a business, you can't, make money in this country because you think a certain way or you hold an opinion that's not even that far out the mainstream, that's a problem.
Yeah, so talking about sort of what the remedies are for this that are consistent with a robust marketplace, while at the same time providing a truly neutral and open public square without so-called capitalists acting like not just corporatists, but Stalinist corporatists, if I may say it. Josh, what do you make of, what should we do? Is Section 230 abrogation, or rather revoking Section 230, which sort of privileges these companies in effect at the sake of everyone else, the right approach? Or is it multiple approaches, lawfare on top of that? How do we approach this issue? Antitrust? Go for it. You're the legal scholar here.
Well, I don't know about scholar, but that's very generous of you, my good friend. Before getting into that, I think Emily said something that could kind of be the standard bearer motto of sorts for this podcast moving forward, which is, she said, fusionism is no longer cutting it. So I don't want to kind of just lose that very witty quip there. I hope we'll come back to that. I fully expect we will come back to that many times. I'll get to the remedies then, but real quick, Rachel did kind of flag what was this kind of very stereotypical libertarian attempt to dunk on me on Twitter. I think he actually got dunked on much harder in return. It's actually a friend of mine from real life, a nice man in real life, a guy named Tom Giovanetti, who basically said that there's nothing conservative about the use of state power to rein in unaccountable corporate oligarchs. That kind of touches on one of the three big issues that I see from what I would say is like an authentic conservative perspective in approaching this issue. The first issue is basically Tom's tweet, and this is kind of what Oren Cass refers to as market fundamentalism, right? It is this notion that private sector action is per se good, should be lauded on an unequivocal basis without any kind of notion as to whether that private sector action is redounding to the public interest, to the common good, to the national good, any of that. And that public sector action, largely according to this view, should per se be condemned. So that's the kind of the first bucket of issues that we're dealing with here from kind of a more theoretical perspective. The second issue, and some of you have already touched on this, is what we're dealing with here as far as the modern big tech Silicon Valley oligarchs. We saw this so clearly with the New York Post censorship of Hunter Biden the Hunter Biden story back in October. We've seen it so clearly with the quite obvious collusion to kind of stab Parler in the back over the past few weeks. We're dealing here not necessarily with purely private actors. This is looking a lot kind of like, and this is kind of a preview of what we're talking about a little later, It's looking a lot to me like Deng Xiaoping style Chinese Communist Party state capitalism, actually, is really what this is. It's much more capitalism with Chinese characteristics, if you will, or Stalinist characteristics, if you kind of borrow Ben's terminology, than actually authentic kind of American laissez-faire capitalism. So it doesn't fall into that bucket as well. The third problem that we're dealing with here, and this is kind of leading to what you were asking me, Ben, is that approaching this issue doesn't neatly fit, unfortunately, within kind of our extent, our existing legal constitutional boxes. I'm a constitutional lawyer by training. I don't know about quote unquote scholar, but I am a lawyer. One issue with our Constitution is that the only provision in the entire document that deals with private action and not state action is the 13th Amendment, which of course outlawed slavery, outlawed both private slavery and state slavery. Everything else is dealing with state action. So the issue here that we're dealing with is how do we reclaim from the unaccountable private actors in kind of new, outside the box, interesting, innovative legal ways, that which our constitutional order, or at least looking at it initially from a 35,000 foot altitude level, does not actually cover. So to directly answer your question, Ben, I personally favor something of an all the above approach. I think Section 230, I'm sure I speak for a lot of us here. Obviously, big tech has not upheld their end of what seemed to me like a pretty clear quid pro quo bargain in '96. If you look at the actual statutory language, and Rachel's written about this prolifically, the Section 230 immunity was expressly predicated upon the fact that these actors who receive this legal immunity would be a platform, or they would be a host for a true diversity of political views. That their end of the bargain is not being upheld. Therefore, we should clearly yank that. Antitrust, I think in some cases like Google is an obvious remedy. In some cases, it's perhaps less obvious. Obviously, network effects are something that people care a lot about. But something that I've really come along to personally, and then I'll kick it back to you, Ben, to close out our segment here, is what Michael Lind, who's just a prolific essayist and someone who I've really come to kind of cherish his thoughts. He had a great piece at Tablet maybe about a week and a half, 2 weeks ago. I think I saw it flagged at the National Conservatism website, where he basically said that all we need to do here is make these companies either common carriers under kind of the traditional American regulatory sense of the term common carrier, or make them liable to public accommodation requirements, similar to the 1964 Civil Rights Act. So we kind of have some legal concepts that we can apply to these actors. It just takes some relevant outside the box thinking. But yes, it has to be an all of the above strategy, Ben.
Yeah, I totally agree on the notion of all of the above, and there are practical reasons, and then there are also philosophical reasons for why it should be all of the above. But I think you hit on an important point, which is what was the purpose of Section 230? And I would advise everyone viewing this, take a look at the text of the bill itself, because the preface for it shows that one of the premises is, and I'll paraphrase it, a free and open marketplace of ideas, and that the internet basically exists to foster that marketplace. So when you talk, Josh, about oligarchs, how did they become oligarchs? It would appear that they took advantage of this privilege and abused it. And of course, corporations always want to destroy their competitors, usually from a business perspective. In this case, it also seems to be from an ideological perspective. And so in terms of potential remedies, look, if they act collusively, they really are engaging in acts that go up against antitrust. And I've seen also arguments for maybe at the state level going after these companies for discriminating against people on an ideological basis, which itself is sort of an interesting way to go about it. And then that Wall Street Journal piece that I talked about the government suppressing free speech by proxy also seems like another interesting avenue to go at. But ultimately, we have to get, of course, to the root cause of this, which is a culture that no longer believes in actually a true free and open marketplace of ideas, that believes that the ideas of half the country are not only beyond contempt, but ought to be thrown out of the marketplace itself. And the fact that it seems everyone at the commanding heights of power adheres to that sort of worldview is the core problem, I think, when we get beyond what are the remedies in the here and now to deal with it. So with that, I will kick it over to Rachel, who will discuss some of the goings on Capitol Hill right now.
Yeah, all the problems they're not dealing with in relation to big tech and anything else. What they are dealing with is, especially in the Senate, you have a 50-50 power dynamic in the Senate, which we haven't seen in about 20 years. The last time was after the 2000 election. The Senate was evenly divided 50-50. And this creates, a number of interesting scenarios for the Senate, because while you can say, oh, the Democrats have control of the presidency and the House and the Senate, they don't have clear-cut control of the Senate. One, because the legislative filibuster is still in place, hopefully for a while, but it requires 60 votes to overcome a filibuster. So Democrats will have to persuade 10 Republicans to come with them, but also because it requires the negotiation of a power sharing agreement. When you have a tie in the Senate, you have to negotiate between the two leaders how things are going to go forward day to day. And this specifically applies to committees, right? The committee ratios, right? How many Republicans and how many Democrats are going to serve on each committee is negotiated at the beginning of every Congress. But in this case, it sounds like there's going to be a split committee, equal representation from Democrats and Republicans. So far from being a helpless minority here, Republicans are actually very powerful. And from where I sit, I'm waiting for Mitch McConnell to leverage some of that power into actual gains for Republicans. And I recently wrote an essay about this for the Federalist saying, look, he has the power to protect the filibuster here, because Chuck Schumer is going to very much want a lot of things, but one of the things he's going to want is every Biden nominee to get out of committee. And Biden nominees will need a majority vote to get out of committee. Well, when you have a tie committee, that's not a given, right? It could be a tie vote, it could be a minority vote. So if we're going to ease that road of transport for those nominees, well, maybe we should get something for it. And this is called power politicking in the Senate. Mitch McConnell, I think, gets this reputation of being like a hard negotiator, but it doesn't look like he's doing that right now. And I think the choices he's making in this power sharing agreement, as well as sort of laying the groundwork for an impeachment of the outgoing president or the ex-president Donald Trump, I think is putting him in some very dangerous waters for the future of the Republican Party.
I'm going to jump in actually with a question for you, Rachel, that I'll preface. And I think it's been interesting to watch the legend of Mitch McConnell grow and build. And actually that's been fostered not just by the conservative movement, but young conservatives using social media to create this legend and this myth of Mitch McConnell, which I think is actually out of step with the reality of who Mitch McConnell is. And I think we're sort of getting a glimpse of that right now. Mitch McConnell, the myth of Mitch McConnell is really predicated on what he did in terms of judges and in terms of our judiciary system. And it's certainly true that he has been absolutely hard, and he's had some sort of an edge, I suppose, as you can say, as to the extent that anybody in Washington, D.C. can have an edge, in taking some of these actions. But from your perspective, as somebody who follows this really closely and studies it, is that Mitch McConnell, he seems to be such a bad man for this moment in conservatism, where, the sort of like tax cuts, Chamber of Commerce, country club Republicanism that Mitch McConnell absolutely represents must take a backseat to the fight for our culture and the fight for our families, our children, and all of these things that are under assault by big tech, et cetera, et cetera. Is he completely the wrong man for this moment? And why are these sort of early glimpses of how he's acted in the first days of the Senate an indication? Why or why not are they an indication that he might be out of step with where the conservative movement is and needs him to be?
Yeah, I want to bust the myth of McConnell, the legislative genius, because what McConnell's actually very good at is doing nothing. And he gets a lot of credit for when he does nothing. Like, he doesn't put Merrick Garland on the floor. He does nothing, and he is lionized for it, right? And, he did sort of focus the Senate on judges in, the last couple of years and sort of remade the judiciary. That wasn't difficult because the filibuster was gone for judges. And when you have a majority of Republicans and you only need 51 votes to confirm judicial nominees, it's not, legislative arm wrestling, it's just scheduling. Okay, you're just putting them on the floor and they're getting confirmed. You're not actually doing the hard work of, mud wrestling, with parliamentary procedure, like through this problem. No. So he gets a lot of credit for things that I think are actually quite simple. And again, he made his job easier by nuking the judicial filibuster, on a series of different levels of judicial nominees, including the Supreme Court. And he nuked the 30 hours of debate post-cloture. So he made it very easy for himself. So I think I want to just lay that out there. But also, I think, to your point, he is, he's a creature of the Beltway. I mean, he's been doing this job for so long. And my read on what he's doing now in terms of really egging on the impeachment of Donald Trump and not really playing hardball with his Democrat counterparts is that he honestly thinks he can shove the Republican Party back into that Chamber of Commerce sized box. He can whip out the 2014 playbook, where there was sort of hand waving about base issues, but really doing nothing and sort of agreeing to the Obama consensus. And that he will be lionized for this and that he will save the Republican Party. I have to think that's how he views it. But that is it doesn't acknowledge at all the changes in the base, and sort of what the Republican Party now reflects, not to mention what conservatives expect. So I really think he's done now. I think he's timed out his usefulness in this role. And I think, one of his biggest failures was he hasn't groomed a successor for himself. So where I think the Senate goes from here, I think it could very easily be sort of destroyed under this McConnell-Schumer watch, but I'm hopeful. I have a small sliver of hope that it will not be.
I think there's, first of all, one test that should always be asked of Republican leadership is what would Democrats do were they in the exact same position as you? And leadership never, and I say this across both houses, never acts the way that Democrats would act were they in an equivalent position. So I appreciate that McConnell in the power sharing agreement that is being negotiated has tried to push taking the filibuster, abolition, nuking off the table. And the Democrats, of course, declined because why would they ever accept such a proposition? And I actually do have real fears, even though reporters ask incessantly, Biden, do you agree that we should preserve the filibuster? And also the Wobblies in their party as well. There seems to be unanimity that it will not be blown up. But look, you just need one more insurrection kind of attempt for there to be a claim that justifies nuking it, because why should we be doing business with terrorists, essentially? Yeah, I mean, you can imagine all the ways that they could come around to that position, whether it's Joe Manchin, Kristen Sinema, or others as well. So I think part of this is that leadership doesn't represent conservatives, and you have to ask then, who does leadership represent at the end of the day? Does it represent its constituents or the constituents who have the most money and therefore have the most power over those in the leadership role? And so it's incumbent upon rank and file Republicans, Republican voters to push for representatives who actually represent their views and not to hate Congress, but then have a 95% approval rating for their representative or their one or two senators in their states. And lastly, just about the point on nominees, if you look at the vote counts coming out so far, it's overwhelmingly pro these initial nominees. And of course, I'm sure that if you put a microphone in front of almost any Republican senator who voted for them, they'd say, look, this person is competent and qualified. And while I disagree with their policy agenda, the fact of the matter is, for the good of continuity and national security and foreign policy, we need this person in place. Okay, do you really believe that they're good for our national security and foreign policy? And do you believe that letting them through beats the benefits of fighting for every last inch so that you hold the other side to account and try to extract maximum concessions? To your point, Rachel, I think it's all about, let's go back to an era before Trump and just assume that this was an aberration and never happened and learn none of the lessons from it, which I think is the takeaway for our entire ruling class on a bipartisan basis. We don't take away any of the lessons from this at all. Instead, we try to just memory hole it and then purge the half the country that led us into this nightmare.
Exactly right.
I think back to the last Federal Society National Lawyers Convention that I was at, which is the big swanky, black tie gala at Union Station in DC, 2,000-3,000 people. It's a huge event. And the last one was November 2019. This most recent one was just virtual because of the pandemic. And McConnell gave a speech there, and he referred to his role of kind of nominating and confirming federal judges as like his most important duty, right, as a Senate Majority Leader. And everyone in the room just got up and just applauded. Now, look, I'm not going to diminish that. I mean, I personally clerked for a wonderful Trump nominee, Judge Jim Ho of the Fifth Circuit. And a lot of these judicial nominees have been wonderful. But by calling that the most important duty of a Senate Majority Leader, one, you kind of by definition are shirking your responsibility to actually enact affirmative legislation, which is part of a broader problem, right, of Republicans being afraid to use political power, which itself is probably downstream of being told for decades that the only thing we're supposed to do is just shrink government, shrink government, shrink government. It's kind of inculcated this mentality that when Republicans actually control government, they have no idea what to do with it, other than just to try and go full Grover Norquist and get it down to drown in a bathtub. But, I was really happy to see our friend Dave Marcus's recent piece of the Federalist saying that it's time for Mitch McConnell to go, because I think during the Trump administration, for reasons that I kind of just alluded to, people forgot that Mitch McConnell is just a total swamp creature. They got distracted by all these flashy judges, obviously 3 Supreme Court justices, and they forgot that Mitch McConnell is a man of the swamp who's been there for literal decades. As far as I can tell, there is one substantive issue that he has been a hardliner on going back to the 80s, which is campaign finance. He cares an awful lot
Don't
about
forget
campaign
war.
finance.
He really likes war too. Those are the 2 issues that motivate him: campaign finance and war.
Right. No, for sure, of course. But I for the life of me can't think of any other reason other than what everyone here has already said as to why Mitch McConnell is playing footsie like the way he's currently playing it, with this charade of a post-office, post-presidency Senate conviction, something of dubious constitutionality in the first place, right? Speaking of the legal nuances here, but it seems to me like it pretty clearly is his time to go. The broader issue here is kind of what I just referenced, is that Republicans just don't know how to use political power, right? Rachel and I, you and I have discussed this kind of in other forums, but Republicans are so much worse than Democrats are at knowing how to punish their enemies and reward their friends within the confines of the rule of law. They don't know how to do it. They don't know how to advance an affirmative agenda, other than, like you alluded to, Rachel, other than kind of just bombing jihadists in random countries, across the world. Other than that, the notion of actually wielding power to pursue an agenda is anathema to large swaths of Conservatism, Inc. And I, for one, hope that dies. And I fear, though, that in order for that kind of notion to die, the Senate, I guess now or the Senate Republican leadership of Mitch McConnell probably has to die with it.
I think that's right. Do we have time for one more topic?
I think we do. So we will finish this NatCon Squad podcast with a discussion of one of the other big issues of the day, which of course is the hegemony of China, the Chinese Communist Party, and whether or not Joe Biden will do anything whatsoever to continue his predecessor's legacy on this most important geopolitical issue. Now, at least for my money, we kind of started this podcast with big tech, unaccountable corporate oligarchy, which is quite possibly, I would say probably, the most pressing domestic issue of the day. There certainly is not a more pressing geopolitical issue than the rise of communist China. Donald Trump, when he was when he was elected to the presidency, so either his first or second day in office, if I'm not mistaken, he was the very first president to take a congratulatory phone call from the Taiwanese, I don't remember the exact title, president, some high-ranking official there. And that was the first time that happened since 1979, when Jimmy Carter imposed our de facto one China policy. And in so doing, at such an early time in his office, Trump did set a tone that he would become the first president since the infamous visit of Richard Nixon to shake hands with Mao in Beijing in 1972 to really change this neoliberal bipartisan paradigm, a paradigm that rested upon, or it was predicated upon, this notion that, however optimistic it may have once been, has just simply been disproven by history. This notion that quote unquote economic liberalization will lead to political liberalization. We've heard this any number of times. In reality, of course, the complete opposite has happened. So we have fed and empowered a rapacious hegemon that is seeking to invade islands from Japan down to Taiwan, is engaging in repeated border skirmishes with deaths with India. We saw that this past summer. And a country that is hoarding PPE, we saw that at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, and is increasingly trying to implement and export its harrowing state surveillance, genocidal, that is an accurate word as well to use, theory of governance onto the world stage. Mike Duran and Peter Ruff at the Hudson Institute had a very lengthy but harrowing essay and tablet back in August talking about what China is doing all across the Middle East. They are literally trying to export their ideology onto the world. It is nothing short of that. Now, the question, of course, is whether Joe Biden, a lifelong China dove, someone who did more than anyone to kind of get China to be a most favored nation status at the World Trade Organization in 2001, someone who perhaps with the exception of Dianne Feinstein, of any sitting US senator, has been more dovish in China more consistently throughout his career. The question is whether Joe Biden has learned any of the relevant lessons of the past 4 years and Donald Trump's flipping of the paradigm. So, Ben, you had a really fantastic piece at the Federal State talking about one element. You obviously write often on this issue, this extremely important issue. So curious if you have any thoughts on whether there's really any semi-realistic possibility that Joe Biden will actually continue this trend.
Well, if past is prologue, then the answer is no. We're going to have a reprisal of the agenda of integration, appeasement, accommodation, and ultimately China's resumed rise to be the dominant hegemonic world power. That goes back to not only support of those trade agreements, of course, but as well his very own words when he was the point man on China in the Obama administration, in which he said that China's rise is a great thing, essentially, for the world. And then he said, come on, man, of course, in response to questions of, is China going to dominate us ultimately? He, of course, has referred to them as a serious competitor, whereas he refers to Russia, which is just incomparably small in terms of its size, strength, might, and ambitions relative to China. It refers to him as an adversary, whereas he refers to China again as a serious competitor, or he says that climate change is the greatest threat to our existence of anything, as opposed to people who use the hard power to imprison 1 million people in modern day gulags and persecute tens of millions of Christians and every single other dissenting force within the country. I think that part of this goes beyond Joe Biden. I mean, I think, and I've written this at length in a number of pieces, and when you add on his family's dealings, pecuniary benefiting from relations with the Chinese Communist Party entities, Communist Party tied individuals and entities, that alone makes him a compromise marked man. And yes, he's had some of his initial appointees who have said some of the right things with respect to China, a softer, gentler, but directionally aligned position, as with the Trump administration, essentially agreeing China's a big problem. We need to do something about it. They put out press releases when China engaged in what appears to be an incursion of Taiwan, multiple incursions, testing and probing to see what the response would be. And basically all we've seen thus far, and it's obviously early days, is words, not an actual response. Same thing to the outgoing Trump administration officials being sanctioned and their families being sanctioned, and any organizations that would do business with them essentially being sanctioned by communist China by dint of working for the evil, bad orange man's regime against communist China. And then you have the Chinese Communist Party officials talking about, we want to have bilateral cooperation with America on the exact issues that the Biden administration says it wants to have contacts in space, which is a strategically significant realm of warfare for China, and yet we're going to cooperate with them there, or in terms of environmentalism or public health. Of all the countries in the world, who would be the worst one to cooperate on public health? I think it might be the country where the coronavirus itself emanated. So we can run down the laundry list of initial data points and then the history, and it's a disaster, I believe, when it comes to Joe Biden, regardless of the fact that some of his nominees have said some of the right things in terms of orientation thus far. The more disturbing thing, and I spend the bulk of my time in my writing and speaking talking about this threat of communist China, but the bigger threat, I would argue, is the fact that we have an unserious ruling class, and I've written this for the American Mind, that not only has not been putting up any fights, but has been effectively on communist China's side. And there are a lot of reasons for that. There's the self-interested kowtowing, where you believe you're getting access to this massive marketplace that they've really never had access to in the way they've expected, and they can never really take their capital out of China either by Chinese law and rule. And then you have, even worse, what I would say is the sort of China envy. And people will look back at Thomas Friedman writing in, I think, 2009, singing paeans to how great the Chinese communist system is versus our democracy. And he sort of tried to walk back those remarks to some degree. But the reality is, so many in our ruling class essentially want to have a social credit system with American characteristics here. And that is far more devastating over the long run than anything that China could do to us. The way that it's going right now, given the China envy and the kowtowing among our elites, and I grant that people in the national security and foreign policy apparatus have shifted on this issue, and I credit the Trump administration with that. But leaving aside that one caveat, the bigger issue I think that we have is, I want to get into a situation where we're actually confronting communist China. I'm not sure we'll even get there at the rate that we're going, as opposed to just being a vassal of communist China, because that's what a ruling class wants at the end of the day, or turning into a little communist China, essentially. That to me is more devastating in some respects.
That's adjacent point that I wanted to make about the importance of ideology here, and the ideology of the people who are in charge of making these decisions. So much of our foreign policy is conducted out of the State Department and conducted out of the White House. And, there's a real belief, and it's sort of hard to reconcile with the fact that this is China, a genocidal regime. And when we mention the genocide, we also don't even sometimes think about the other human rights abuses and the human rights abuse that is their social credit system in and of itself, which is absolutely despicable and not the way that people deserve to live in this sort of state-run technological panopticon. It certainly could be coming here in some form, but the people that are making these decisions really genuinely believe in that sort of like neoliberal theory of foreign cooperation. And some of them have not shifted away from that. And I kind of think Joe Biden, for the topic of this conversation, is one of those people who still hasn't shifted to believe that China is not somebody that this is not a country that interacting with will bring about harmony. In no way is that theory correct. It has been disproven, but for some reasons, maybe because they know people in the CCP and they've been friendly with them over the years in diplomatic relations, maybe because they personally profited from China, maybe because they still believe very firmly in what they were telling themselves for the last 2 decades about cooperation with China, and they just don't want to give that up. These people really, really believe that our interactions with China, diplomatic interactions with China, can bring about harmony. It's very difficult to, again, wrap your head around that when you're looking at what China is doing to its own people and things like Belt and Road, which are directly aimed at undermining the United States. But I still think that there's the people that Joe Biden is likely to bring into his administration. I'm not sure that Tony Blinken is one of them, because he's actually been fairly good when it comes to the Uyghurs, for instance. But it's just really, really important that you have people in those positions making decisions that have shifted from that neoliberal theory of cooperation. And I'm not confident that this administration will bring such people into the fold.
One of the things that you just mentioned, Emily, that I think is so true in the sense of, we still have this firmly rooted belief in sort of the economic purification of economic ties, right? The more business we do with China, the better they'll become. And it sort of goes back to your sentiment about sort of this neoliberal view of openness. We just have to talk and trade more, and then we'll all be good. What I don't think we've prepared ourselves for, not just from a foreign policy infrastructure, but also just from, I think, a governing economic philosophy, is that Belt and Road is insidious in this way, right? It brings actual Chinese influence through the mechanisms of the free market in ways that we just aren't prepared to be skeptical of, right? This was very true with TikTok, right? We just didn't know how to deal with a private company, right? That was actually sort of a hegemon or an arm of the Chinese state. We had no plan in place policy-wise to deal with that. We got our collective stuff together around Huawei, which I think was good, but Huawei is another example of this, right? Like a so-called private industry coming to compete with us, supposed to make us better because the free market is great, right? But it's actually an impetus or an avenue for Chinese influence. And we just aren't prepared to deal with that. And I think you also see it with Chinese money, where Chinese money is going. When you have the head of the Brookings Institute going on sponsored content for Huawei, you kind of have a problem here that we need to address through disclosure, through kind of all this kind of stuff. So I just think, we need to sort of create a posture that is prepared to deal with the, multiple ways in which China aggresses, because it's not just in the traditional way. It's not just sort of in military might or, diplomatic relations. It's through these very significant avenues of soft power that we've completely opened ourselves up to, and then now have no way to really respond, I suppose.
The one point I'd add to that really briefly is they have perfectly taken advantage of our openness, our greed, our naivete, and pursued every single avenue that you would pursue if you were trying to take advantage of a people in the American people who genuinely, I think, want to have a bountiful economy, think that free trade does lead to peaceful relations, as opposed to the fact that you might be dealing with a leadership class in the Chinese Communist Party that actually wants to be the dominant player in the world and will take advantage of every single means to achieve it. And we've talked about the word harmony has been used a couple of times. And I think there's a question of harmony on whose terms. And I would say it's Xi Jinping who's defining what harmony means. And there was this concept during the Cold War that a lot of doves talked about and people on the Soviet side talked about of convergence, that both sides were going to essentially meet in the middle at the end of the day. And I think what we've seen is that trade did not lead China to become more like us. In reality, we have become more like communist China as a consequence of these relations. Those relations have corrupted our side and essentially subsidized, underwritten, enabled their side to be in a position where they could go from a communist basket case that had slaughtered tens of millions of its people during its revolutions to a place now where they really do rival us. And until we're at a place where, for example, every single business entity that's powerful in China, and even the not powerful ones, are understood to be, at very least, potential weapons of the Chinese Communist Party, and almost all of them actually, in the end, vehicles of the Chinese Communist Party. Until we're there, we're going to be light years behind them, unfortunately.
Yeah, no, look, we're coming up to the end of the show here, but we're all in agreement. This notion that economic liberalization per se leads to political liberalization is kind of the zombie that has to be slayed here, right? And just a very quick personal anecdote. I've been to Hong Kong. I've actually not been to mainland China, but I was actually in Cuba 2 years ago. A story for another day there. This is obviously after President Obama took steps to, quote unquote, open up Cuba. And I'll never forget, literally the first thing you see when you leave the airport in Havana, you look to your left, there is this sprawling billboard of this person in handcuffs, and the handcuffs have American flag on them, and they're bleeding. And it says in Spanish, embarcadero. It says embargo, bloodiest genocide in human history. And you ride around Havana, you see, you see Marx, you see Chavez, you see Castro, you see Che Guevara, murals everywhere. So this notion that economic liberalization leads to political liberalization is just utterly nonsensical. But we are totally out of time here. So we will wrap up on that note. So hope you enjoyed this episode of NatCon Squad. We will be back next week. In the interim, please subscribe to Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Stitcher, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. And on behalf of Ben, Emily, and Rachel, I'm Josh Hammer, and we'll see you next week.